So the Trump organization, when Donald Trump left the White House, was in rough shape. They had just taken a beating during the pandemic. Hotels had closed. They had to fire over 2,400 workers from their business. On top of that, they were dealing with fallout from January 6th. So some banks and other real estate firms said that they no longer wanted to do anything with the Trump organization, so they had to figure out how to manage that. And then on top of that, they were also contending with an investigation from the Manhattan District Attorney, who was just months away from charging them with a series of financial crimes. So all of this stuff was building up at once. And you had a lot of outsiders looking at this picture and saying basically, this is a tower that's about to collapse. And Donald Trump is going to be left there with a bunch of rubble and nothing. So in reality, Donald Trump is fine. He got through this period. He's gotten through difficult periods before, and he's done it again. Basically what he did was he refinanced 4 of his properties, allowing him to suck a lot of cash out of some of those properties. He paid down the loans on another 4 of his properties, handling the debt there. And then maybe most critically, he sold one of his big money losers, the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. This had been a property that got a lot of attention, looked like it was making a lot of money, in fact, was losing millions of dollars a year. And Donald Trump not only got rid of it by selling it, but sold it for an enormous amount of money, far more than anybody really thought that it was worth. And at the end of the day, he has a cleaned up balance sheet. He's sitting on an estimated $375 million of cash. He still has a significant amount of debt, but he's kicked the can down the road. Now those loans aren't due for years, and he's going to get through this just fine. So basically, for a real estate billionaire like Donald Trump, you're allowed to refinance, whenever you want. But unlike sort of in the political world where you have investigators or perhaps, prosecutors looking at your conduct and saying what you can and can't do, in this case, it's banks who are playing that role. So banks are going to decide whether or not they're going to lend to you again. The tricky thing for Trump is that after January 6th, a lot of banks said that they wanted nothing to do with Donald Trump. But of course, if there's one rule that we know about Wall Street is there's always more people looking to make money. So if certain banks say, hey, we don't want to work with this guy, other banks are going to say, what a great opportunity. Business just fell into our lap. And so they're going to look at what his profile is and say, okay, what are the value of these assets? How much income are these assets throwing off? And then how much of a complication is it that this company, the Trump organization, is under indictment actively right now? And ultimately, several lenders came to the conclusion that those weren't things that they really had to worry too much about, and that they would lend him money anyways because they thought that he would be able to repay those debts and also pay interest on top of it. And in doing so, they would make a significant amount of money for their banks. Stephen Roth and Donald Trump have known each other for years. Their relationship goes back decades. But for about the last 12 or 15 years, they've been business partners. And they're business partners on 2 sort of anonymous, boring, but big money-making buildings. One in San Francisco, one in New York City. The one in San Francisco is called 555 California Street. The one in New York City is called 1290 Avenue of the Americas. The interesting thing with Trump's debt situation is that he had a lot of equity locked up in those 2 buildings. But because Vornado owned 70% of the buildings and Trump only had 30% of the buildings, he wasn't actually in full control about whether or not he could access that equity, whether or not they would sell the things or whether they would refinance it in such a way that would allow him to pull cash out. But ultimately, Stephen Roth did him a favor. They refinanced 555 California Street and replaced the loan that had $533 million of debt on it with one that had $1.2 billion. That allowed the 2 partners to suck out more than $600 million of cash. Trump himself, collected roughly $150 million of cash from that refinance. And then they also refinanced 1290 Avenue of the Americas, replacing a $950 million loan with one of the same size. So the end effect is that Donald Trump has both of those loans now pushed out until about 2028, and he's got a whole lot more cash sitting on his balance sheet in the meantime that he could then deploy in other parts of his business. the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. was a big problem from the start. The Trump organization said that it was going to invest $200 million into fixing up the building, turning it into a luxury hotel. And in exchange for doing that, they would get the right to then lease the building from the federal government, which would mean that they had to pay $3 million a year to the federal government in rent, and then they could operate the building as a hotel. But the building was never set up to make enough money to cover the interest on the debt that they used to spend $200 million there, or the amount of rent that they had to cover with the federal government. So ultimately what ended up happening is that the building just lost money for years. So amidst all of this, the Trumps kind of came up with this crazy plan, which is, hey, why don't we sell this money-losing hotel for like a wild amount of money? You know, the rumor came out that they would be willing to accept something in the ballpark of like $500 million. Now, at the time, you know, most independent people thought that it was worth somewhere between like 200, maybe $250 million or something like that. And ultimately, they found a buyer who paid a reported $375 million, which sounds like a big discount from $500 million. But when you consider that the place was actually worth a fraction of that, it's a huge, huge amount of money that the Trump organization got to take in. And it allowed them to pay off their Deutsche Bank debt, that $170 million that they had borrowed to renovate the building. And it also allowed them to take a bunch of money into their own pockets at the end of the day. Donald Trump for years was able to rely on Deutsche Bank. They were a really close lender of his. He started using them back in the 1990s, continued using them up until recent times. His active loans that he had with Deutsche Bank, one in Chicago, one in Miami, one in DC, were against some of his most troubled properties, but Deutsche Bank gave him the money anyway. And it really allowed him some flexibility to do things that he wouldn't necessarily have been able to do had he not had a lender who was so agreeable. Deutsche Bank, after January 6th, spread the word that they didn't want anything to do with Donald Trump. So all of a sudden you have this question of, well, who's going to pick up the slack? These Deutsche Bank loans are coming due. Is he going to be able to pay this stuff out of pocket, or is he going to be able to refinance? What ended up happening is in stepped a small internet-based bank that's based out of San Diego called Axos Bank. This is not a bank that most people have heard of. It's not a bank that historically has done a lot of big deals, but they have done some big deals with Donald Trump recently. First, they refinanced Trump Tower, giving the president $100 million there to repay a previous loan that he had coming due. And secondly, they refinanced Doral, which is a golf resort down in Miami. Again, giving him $125 million so he could pay off Deutsche Bank and continue operating. They also had an interesting involvement in the DC hotel where they took part of the interest in the debt that went toward paying for that $375 million purchase price. So in 3 of these deals, this small unheard of bank called Axos pops up. And what it leaves you with the impression is that Donald Trump has found his replacement for Deutsche Bank. So Donald Trump still has plenty of debt. He has an estimated $1.1 billion of debt. Now remember, he also has significant assets. So it's not like he's broke or anything like that. But he does have a lot of debt that ultimately he's going to have to pay back. The beauty of what he's done with this restructuring is he's given himself a lot of flexibility. So now he has an estimated $375 million of cash on his balance sheet. If people aren't going to allow him to refinance some other loans, he can now pay more of them back. He also could theoretically just refinance again. He could, of course, screw it up. I mean, he could, go do something that is, a really ambitious project that he doesn't necessarily have money for, and all of a sudden he could be in a tight pinch again. But right now he's sort of sitting pretty.